Most of us here, so let me explain what it means to be the Frank Ramsey Professor of Economics. Frank Ramsey was a gifted British mathematician, philosopher, and economist who died at the age of 26. He was born in 1903 and died in 1930. Frank Ramsey's contributions to philosophy commenced when, at the age of 19, he translated Wittgenstein. Before he died, he had produced a number of original philosophical papers. Frank Ramsey was urged to work on economics by nobody less than John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes thought that Ramsey, and I quote, says, from a very early age, about the age of 16, Frank Ramsey's precocious mind was intensely interested in economic problems. And so he encouraged him to work on economics. Frank Ramsey responded to this encouragement by writing 3 papers of fundamental importance, and all 3 of which are still studied today. Paul Samuelson has called them the 3 great legacies, and legacies that were actually the byproduct of Frank Ramsey's interest in mathematics and the foundations of knowledge. Frank Ramsey's contribution to mathematics is also important. There's now a theorem that bears his name called the Ramsey theorem, and there's a theory that is studied by Ph.D. students even today. So therefore, to be holding the professorship at Cambridge University named after Frank Ramsey is a very high honor. Before Professor Munshi held this chair, it was held by the eminent economist Sir Partha Dasgupta. Professor Munshi, therefore we are very honored to have you here. Before taking up the Frank Ramsey professorship, Professor Munshi was at Brown University. He also taught economics at the University of Pennsylvania and Boston University. Professor Munshi's research has been devoted almost exclusively to the analysis of communities and their interaction with economic activity. His early research focused on social learning in the adoption of agricultural and contraceptive technology and the identification of migrant labor market networks. His subsequent research examined the effect of community networks on education, health, and mobility, which are key determinants of growth and development. Much of this research has been situated in India. In India, as we know, caste is a natural social domain around which networks are organized. Some of his other work has been situated in diverse locales, including Kenya, Bangladesh, and the United States. His research over the past 20 years has been supported in part by the US National Science Foundation and the US National Institutes of Health. It has been published in top-tier economics journals, including the American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and the Review of Economic Studies. Professor Munshi is currently co-editor of the Journal of Development Economics. And as he told me, he's planning to work on a book that would make some of the work that he's doing right now accessible to more general lay audience. I'm very happy to have you here. The idea of calling him here, one important idea was that except we are interested in many problems in urban planning and in public policy, and we know that these problems can be much better understood and addressed if we were to make more use of the concepts of economics. And so we thought it would be very fitting to get an economist to do the convocation address and this talk in the evening. I'm very happy that you are here, Kaivan. Please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Let me just jump straight in. So the question that I want to try to answer today is, why is it that caste continues to play such an important role in Indian life? Well, one explanation is that ancient inequities and prejudices are slow to change. A second explanation is that caste reservation has perpetuated a system that would otherwise have withered away. A third explanation is that caste identity has been exploited by politicians. What I want to talk about today is a fourth explanation, which has received much less attention in the academic literature as well as in the popular press. This explanation is based on the idea that caste networks have historically provided and continue to provide important forms of economic support for their members. And for you to understand this explanation, I need to first of all tell you what a network is and why it is the case that networks in India are organized along caste lines. Okay, so for those of you who've studied undergraduate economics, and I guess for those of you who haven't, it doesn't really matter. The basic idea is that if you think about the classical world that these textbooks will try to teach you, markets function perfectly. What that means is that an individual is assigned to occupations on the basis of his ability and talents. Once he has a job, he continues to put in effort diligently, even if his employer can't actually observe his effort. And if he ever has a negative income shock, he's able to go to the bank, get credit, and smooth out his consumption. Okay? Now, of course, this is not the world that we live in. This is not the world of a developing economy at all. In that world, when an individual comes to the city, firms don't know about his ability and his talents. When he does get a job, he may not work very hard because he doesn't know how long he's going to stay in that job. And if he gets a negative income shock, he can't go to the bank. He isn't going to get a loan from the bank. So what happens in such a world? What happens in such a world is that social groups, close-knit communities, come together to provide support for their members. So when this individual comes to the city, someone from his group, from his community, who already has a job, provides a referral. This individual is known to that person knows his ability, he knows his talents. If this individual reneges on his obligation once he has that job, he can be punished not only by that incumbent person who gave the referral, but by other members of the community as well. Now, why does the individual giving the referral do this for him? Well, he has a reputation at stake within the firm, which can presumably be improved when he provides a referral and gets good people into the firm as well. Okay, so this is how the system works. When someone who moves to the city, for example, gets a negative income shock, again, his referral comes in. Somebody from his social group gives him help, gives him some kind of financial support. In the future, when roles are reversed, this person is going to help somebody else in his community, and this goes on from one year to the next. Nothing is in writing, nothing is formal. These are informal institutions, but they work extremely well when groups have strong social ties. Okay, and they essentially substitute for imperfectly functioning markets. Okay, so now you think about a country like India. What would be the natural unit around which you would organize these kinds of networks? Well, of course, it's the caste or the jati. The basic rule in Indian society, as you all know, is that you have to marry within your caste or jati. What that means over many, many generations is that you have very, very close social ties within that particular group. What those social ties do is to improve information flows. People know what's going on within that group, and they also will solve commitment problems. So now, for example, if someone from my caste gives me a job referral, and I renege on my obligation in the future and I don't work very well, I will be punished by a whole bunch of other people from my own caste group. If, for example, I get help from someone of my caste to smooth out my consumption when I have a negative income shock, and I don't do the same in the future when I'm called upon to do so, again I can be punished by a whole bunch of people from my own caste group. And so what you might imagine is that networks have been organized historically, and they continue to be organized around this particular social unit in India. Okay? Now, if you go back in time, I would imagine that the first use that these networks were put to was to smooth consumption in the village. People have negative income shocks in the village when they have a bad rainfall is low in a given year, crop yields are low. Instead of just having less consumption in that particular year, they get a transfer, they get something from someone else from their caste who perhaps lives in another village. With the arrival of the British and the growth of cities in India, it was the same caste which supported the movement of their members from the village to the city. Okay, once they were in the city, they helped their members find jobs, and this has been very well documented by Indian historians. You had the foreman, the jobber, or the Kangani, as he was called in South India, who will often find jobs for people from his own community. Now, from the outside, it looks to us like nepotism or favoritism. He's finding jobs for his own people. But in reality, he knows who to pick. And once he's picked those people, he can make sure to discipline them and make sure that they work hard. Okay, now today, with the liberalization of the Indian economy, with globalization, you might ask, are these networks disappearing? Are they fading away? In fact, they're not, because there are many new opportunities for these networks. With liberalization, with the growth of the Indian economy, you have new business opportunities. New communities can now move into business, but how do they do that? They do that with the support of their community networks. And so the point that I want to try to bring across to you in today's talk is that these networks will continue to remain in place, and caste will continue to remain relevant as long as markets don't function perfectly. As long as there is a role for these networks, the caste system will continue to be in place. It will continue to be important. Now, I don't want to undermine the importance of the other explanations that I gave earlier. Yes, caste politics is out there. Yes, prejudice is out there. Yes, reservation probably does matter. But what I want to do is to sort of show that there's another story out there as well for why the caste system continues to be persistent. So what I'm going to do in today's talk is to begin by essentially documenting the role that these networks continue to play today, both in rural as well as in urban India. After that, I'm going to focus on one aspect of these networks, the connection to mobility. And the reason why I focus on mobility is because of its importance in the development process. What ultimately distinguishes a developing economy from a developed economy is mobility. In a developing economy, you are tied to the land that you're born on. You ultimately inherit the occupation of your father, so the sweeper's son becomes a sweeper, the cardiac surgeon's son becomes a cardiac surgeon. But that's not the way it is in a developed economy, in a well-functioning economy. In that economy, individuals are assigned to occupations and to locations on the basis of their abilities and their talents. And that's what you want to think about when you think about the development process. What is it that impedes or supports mobility in a developing economy? And my view is that networks, and in the Indian context, caste networks, have a very important role in explaining variation in mobility, changes in mobility over time, as well as across different locations. And so what I will do today is to essentially discuss two applications. In the first application, I will talk about how a particular caste was able to actually make the move from agricultural labor and then later industrial labor into international business over the course of a single generation with the support of its caste network. In the next application, I will talk about how the same caste networks can actually restrict the mobility of their members. And I'll conclude by just discussing prognosis for the persistence of caste networks in India in the future. Okay? So let me jump into the first topic, which is some kind of basic documentation that these caste networks continue to be active in India today. So this is data from the Rural Economic Development Survey. So this is a survey that's been conducted by the National Council of Applied Economic Research at different points in time over the last 40 years. And what we're looking at here are basically data from two rounds of the survey in 1982 and in 1999. What the survey does is to essentially get very detailed information from a small number of households in a bunch of villages in India, over all the major states. And one of the questions that they ask these households is whether they gave or received gifts or loans within their caste in the year preceding the survey. So it's just over 1 year. And what you see over here is that 25% of the households in the 1982 round and 20% of the households in the 1999 round report that they gave or received gifts or loans within their caste. Now, if you extended this over a longer period of time, of course, the number would be much, much larger. If you went over 10 or 20 years, most households, I would suspect, would report that they gave or received gifts or loans within their caste group. Now, how important are these loans? In terms of the amount that is given by households, it's about 5 to 8% of their annual income. This is just a given point in time. When it comes to receiving these gifts and loans, it's as high as 20 to 40% of the annual income. So the point is that these loans are very important. And I'm right now doing fieldwork in South India, and we're looking at households and looking in very great detail at these transfers. And what you find is that when it comes to something major, like an operation or a marriage, that is when the caste is most important. When you need a very large amount of money, you can't go to the bank, you can't go to the money lender. It's the caste which gives you this kind of support. And this is more evidence along the same lines. This is from the 1982 survey round. This is looking at the purpose to which these loans were used. Now here we're focusing only on the loans, and it's important to note that these loans make up just 23% of the total value of the transfers within the caste. Most of the stuff is coming through gifts, where there's no reciprocation. Okay? You don't have to give anything back. So if you compare the caste loans with bank loans and with money lender loans, what you see is that actually they are very, very important. Bank loans are the most important overall. This is as early as 1982. But if you look at certain purposes, if you look at major contingencies, which is column 3, if you look at consumption expenses, which is column 4, you see that the caste loans are either the most important or one of the most important sources of these loans. And on what terms do you actually get these loans? Well, of course, they're very favorable, because when you get these caste loans, there's no interest and there's no collateral. So 20% of the caste loans are without any interest and without any collateral. And this is data, in the last column we have data from the India Human Development Survey, which is more recent in 2005, and you still see the same basic patterns. And so the point is that a household in rural India is very much dependent on its caste network to smooth out its consumption, to meet major contingencies. Okay, and this hasn't changed over time. So this is rural India. Let's now turn to urban India. This is data from a survey of Maharashtrian school children in one area in Bombay, in Dadar, that I conducted in 2001. What we did was to go to interview the parents of these students. And as part of the interview, we asked them about their first job, and we asked them whether they received a referral from someone from their own caste for that first job of theirs. And what you find is, for those parents who are in working class jobs, which is unskilled manual, skilled manual, or organized blue-collar occupations, you find that close to 70% of these parents report that they received a referral from someone from their own caste to get that first job. For white-collar occupations, which are business, professional, or clerical occupations, the numbers are lower, but it's still quite substantial at around 43%. Now, in fact, these numbers are very similar to what you would get in the US, for example. If you ask people about job referrals in the US labor market today, it would be about 70% for working class jobs and about 40% for white-collar jobs. But what's interesting here is that these numbers are just for referrals within the caste. So you can see how important the caste is even in Bombay city today. The last thing I want to show you is data from a survey that I conducted of diamond export firms in the Bombay market in 2004-2005. As many of you know, this is a very heavily networked industry. And I knew that when I started this project, I would need social connections of my own to get these firms to talk. And so what I did is I actually spent 2 years building up a small network of my own within the industry. I started off with a small group of people who I knew socially. Through them, I got connected to other firms. And by the time I actually started the survey, I had a small network of firms that I was connected to, or who I knew, in each of the 3 major communities in this industry. The 3 communities are the Kathiawardis. These are firms who are from Kathiawar in Gujarat, but they are basically Kanbi Patels, for those of you who know the caste structure. Then you have Marwadis, and then you have Palampuri Jains. Okay, and so what I did when I did the survey was to start off with the firms that I knew, and for each of them I would say, give me 5 firms that you're closely connected to. And then I would go to those 5 firms and say that this person has told me to come to you, and he has said that if you have any questions, you should contact him. And in many cases, the firms did contact the person providing the referral, and they reassured them that in fact this was a legitimate academic study and there was no issue at all. So we ended up with an over 80% response rate on this survey. But the point is that we actually had this very interesting information from the process of collecting the data. And so what you see over here is in fact the fraction of referrals that firms made to other firms from their own community. So in our sample of firms, 32% of the firms are Kathiawadi. But what you find is that 74% of the referrals were made to other Kathiawadi firms. In our data, 17% of the firms are Marwadi. And yet 43% of the referrals were made to other Marwadi firms. And then finally, 52% of the firms are Palampuri, and 78% of the referrals are made to other Palampuri firms. So what you're seeing here is this very strong sort of intra-group affinity. You're much more likely to report someone that you know who belongs to your own group within this industry. This is of course not a surprise because we know that the diamond industry is so heavily networked. In fact, 95% of the firms belong to just these three communities. But this is still very striking. What you're seeing here is the importance of these networks, not just in village India, but even in the city. What I want to do now, given this very brief sort of background on the importance of caste networks, is to talk about the connection between these networks and mobility. I'm going to talk about how these networks, to begin with, can facilitate mobility, and the application is going to be the Indian diamond industry. Okay, so in general, what role do networks play in supporting mobility? And my view of this is that in an economy, think about a world, a traditional economy, the type that you know, a developing economy, what do you need to become a businessman? Now, if you're the son of a businessman, you have many, many advantages. You're going to inherit wealth. You're going to get connections from your father. He's going to teach you how to work the system, who to bribe, who not to bribe, how to take advantage of different loopholes in the law, and so forth. Suppose you're not the son of a businessman. How could you ever succeed in business? It would be very difficult. And this is where the network comes in. What the network does in some sense is to substitute for the inherited parental support that a son of a businessman gets. What the members of the network do is to provide capital to each other. They provide information to each other. And this allows them to ultimately, in some sense, bootstrap their way out of one occupation into business. Now, I'm not going to get into the details over here, but what my theoretical model shows in this paper is that in those communities which have the weakest outside options, which have been historically disadvantaged, once a new network forms, it's actually going to strengthen relatively fast. And the reason is quite obvious. These people have very little to lose by moving from their traditional occupation into this new occupation. But the problem, of course, is that it's very difficult for this new network to actually form in the first place. But the key is to get it going. So once you get this network up and running, it will strengthen most rapidly in historically disadvantaged communities. So here's a lesson for us for policy. If we can somehow get historically disadvantaged communities to move into new networked occupations, including business, we will actually see them making this intergenerational movement much faster than historically advantaged communities. And here's some evidence along those lines from the diamond industry. So to begin with, let me tell you a little bit about how this industry is organized. Okay? So there's basically three steps in the production process. First, you've got to buy the rough stones. India, as you know, doesn't produce rough diamonds. So in most cases, the exporters will go to Antwerp, to the Antwerp market. They'll go every month or every couple of months, just for a few days. They'll buy the stones over there, and typically these exporters will specialize in stones of a particular size. So when they go to the market, they need to get it from particular suppliers. And the person they want it from, depending on the supply of stones from one month to the next, could be a different person. Now the problem is that when they get these stones, they get them on credit. Nothing is in writing. So these stones are very valuable. They're often worth a few $100,000. So think about it. Suppose an exporter from India shows up in the Antwerp market. He goes to some supplier, a rough supplier, and he finds stones that he wants. And he tells this person, okay, give me these stones on credit without anything in writing, and I will, polish the stones, I will sell the stones, and I will give you back your payment with some, interest or whatever in, let's say, 3 months. What credibility does he have? What's to stop him from basically taking the stones and never returning? This is a huge market. He could go from one supplier to the next over, 5 or 10 years, and no one would find out that he's cheating one person after the other. And this is where the network comes in. It basically solves the commitment problem. So most of these exporters will have long-term relationships with a small number of suppliers. Now suppose I go or in a given month and I want stones from someone who I don't have long-term relationships with. What I will do is to go to a member from my community who does have a long-term relationship with that person. That person will stand guarantor for me. Okay? If I renege on my obligation and I don't return the money, I will be punished not just by that one person, but by all the other members of my community. Now, why does that person give me the referral? He gives it to me because, of course, he wants to build up his reputation with that particular supplier in Antwerp. So everyone is better off. I end up returning the money. The person from my community who has a long-term relationship ends up improving his reputation with the firm, and the firm can sell me the rough stones on credit with nothing in writing. So that is how this particular network works in this particular industry. Now, once I get the rough stones, I can come back to India. I can get them cut and polished in factories and workshops, many of which are in Surat and Navsari. There, if I'm a Palampur or a Marwari businessman, I can form a long-term relationship with my labor contractor. And typically what you find in this industry is that they will have relationships which are like 10 years and 15 years long. So then you don't need my community, I don't need my community network. I have my own long-term relationship with this person which will support trust. Once I get the polished stones, then I can go to the Bombay market and I can sell it to what are called merchant exporters or to foreign buyers who are in the market, or directly to foreign buyers that I know in Antwerp or in London or elsewhere. Okay, and that's basically how this industry works. Now, historically, when the Indian industry started to come up in the mid-1960s, two traditional business communities handled the business end of the industry: the Palampuri Jains and the Marwadis. The cutting and the polishing was handled by the Kathiawardis. So the Kathiawardis were historically agricultural laborers who moved to Surat when the industry was starting up, and they handled the cutting and polishing at the time. Now, what's interesting for us is that there is a supply shock in the late 1970s. In 1979, there was a discovery of massive diamond deposits in Australia's Argyle mines. So these mines produce today 1/3 of the world's diamonds by volume, not by quality. These are actually very low quality stones, but there's a very large volume of diamonds. And so at that point in time, some of the Palampuri businessmen who had set up by that point branches in Antwerp encouraged their Kathiawadi contractors to move into the business. Once these contractors came into the business, they brought in other members of their own community, and over time the Kathiawadi network strengthened. Now, as I told you, what the theory says is that when a disadvantaged community manages to form its network, that network is going to strengthen more rapidly than the network in more advantaged communities. And that's what we're going to look at in a minute. Okay, so this is now data from the survey of diamond firms that I conducted, as I said, in the Bombay market in 2004-2005. So I have close to 800 firms in my data, and I have information on when they actually entered the industry or entered the business. So this is based on the year of establishment of these firms. You can figure out at each point in time how many firms were there by community in the industry. And so clearly the Palampuris are always dominant, and they're growing at a steady rate. The Kathiawadis and the Marwadis, they're growing more slowly to begin with, but starting from the mid-1980s, you can see the trajectory for the Kathiawadis getting steeper. And this is not visually discernible, but if you actually compare the trajectory of the Kathiawadis and the Palampuris after 1985, it's actually statistically significantly faster than for the Palampuris. So you're seeing more Kathiawadi firms coming in from the mid-1980s or so. Okay, what was the background of these firms coming in? So this is now telling you about the family background of these entrepreneurs who were coming in based on the year of establishment or the year of entry of the firm. So on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, what you have is a year of establishment. On the y-axis, you have the probability or the fraction of firms who report that their father was a businessman. And the idea here is that as the network gets stronger over time, the fraction of firms who don't have a business background themselves should be getting larger. So it should be these things should be going down over time, right? But if you look at the Palampuris and the Marwadis, what you see is that it is declining, but it's relatively shallow. And statistically, you cannot reject that, in fact, there's no decline at all for those two communities. But look at the Kathiawadis. Starting from the late 1970s, you see this very sharp decline. And by 1995, basically 80% of the Kathiawardis who were entering the business report that their father was not a businessman. So this is just remarkable intergenerational mobility in a single generation. And if you look more carefully in the data at what these fathers were doing, most of the fathers at that point in time were actually farmers. So what you're seeing is in one generation, these people are moving from farming into international business. I mean, these are major firms, okay? You're going to see later on that turnover is in, $2 or $3 million a year. So it's actually remarkable that these people were able to make the switch from one generation to the next. Apart from their family background, what about their education? And what you see is, again, not surprisingly, it was weaker for the Kathiawardis over time. So the blue line gives you, so okay, let me tell you what this is now. So on the x-axis, what you have is the year of establishment of the firm, yet again. And on the y-axis, what you have, that's the vertical axis, is the years of schooling of these firms, of the owners of these firms. And what you see is, over time, the years of schooling of the Kathiawadi firms is declining very steeply. The red line is for the Palampuris, and the green line is for the Marwadis. Okay, so what's happening over time is that these Kathiawadi firms who are coming in, they just look weaker and weaker. They're less likely to have a father who was a businessman. They have less education over time as well. And why is this happening? Of course, my story is that what's happening is that there's an underlying community network which is getting stronger and stronger over time. And that's allowing individuals with weaker backgrounds to come into the industry and compete successfully with people with stronger individual backgrounds. Okay? So what can I give you to support this idea that the network was getting stronger for the Kathiawardis? Well, one thing I can do is to actually look at the organization of production of these firms. There's two ways in which a firm can be organized in this industry. The first method of organization is what I just told you, where these firms will go every month or every couple of months. They'll get their stones from Antwerp, they'll come back, they'll have it cut and polished, and then they'll sell the polished stones. The second thing a firm can do is to establish its own branch in Antwerp and operate as a supplier as well as an exporter at the same time. Those firms, they don't need to be connected to the Kathiawadi or to the community network at all, because they have their own presence in the Antwerp market. And what we're looking at over here is a fraction of firms who actually report that they are still connected to the network in the sense that they don't have a branch in Antwerp. And what you see over time is that for both the Palampuris and the Marwadis, that fraction is declining, as you might imagine. But for the Kathiawardis, it's exactly the opposite. It's actually getting stronger and stronger over time, presumably because their own network is getting stronger and stronger. If you look at marriage patterns, which we know are so closely connected to these networks, you see the same story. This is the fraction of the entrepreneurs who report that they married a woman from a diamond family. So this is not about marrying within their own community. This is more than that. This is about marrying within your own community, within the industry. And what you see once again is the fraction of Kathiawardis who report marrying within the community. This is controlling for the number of firms, by the way, in the industry, which is obviously changing over time. You can see that that is growing much more steeply for the Kathiawardis than for the other two communities. And if you look at their children, you see the same pattern here again. It's growing more steeply for the Kathiawardis, this is the blue line, than it is for the Palampuris, which is the red line, as well as for the Marwadis, which is the green line. Okay, so here is some indirect evidence that the Kathiawadi network was strengthening more rapidly than for the other two communities. And perhaps that is why weaker and weaker Kathiawadis could come in over time. But what were the consequences of all of this for the performance of these firms? At some level, we need to know that, right? So what I managed to do at the end of the survey was to get data on the exports of 95% of these firms from the Gem and Jewelry Export Promotion Council. So they actually gave me data over a 10-year period. And of course, some of these firms would have been coming in, at different points in time. So it would be for a shorter period for those firms which entered later. Now, two things are happening here. On one hand, the Kathiawadi network is getting stronger. But at the same time, we're seeing that the individual Kathiawadis who are coming in are getting weaker and weaker. So the net effect of that on their performance is ambiguous. We don't know how they're going to perform at the end because there are these two forces that are working in opposite directions. And what you find actually is they end up actually growing about as rapidly as the Palampuris. Again, the Kathiawadis are the blue line, the Palampuris are the red line, the Marwadis are the green line. So they're growing, the Palampuris and the Kathiawadis are growing at about the same rate over time, over the 10-year period from 1995 to 2004, and the Marwadis are growing less fast. On the y-axis, the vertical axis, what you have is the exports in millions of dollars. So you can see here that these firms are actually producing a lot. Profit margins might be low in this industry, but nevertheless, if you look at the sales, they're really quite high. Right? You're talking about millions of dollars here. Now, what I do finally is to control for these firm characteristics. We know that these firms, the Kathiawadi firms in particular, were weaker and weaker over time. They were less likely to have a businessman as a father. They had less education. When you control for all of that, what you find is that the trajectory for the Kathiawadis, as you would imagine, is much steeper than it is for the other two communities. What you're seeing here is what I would think of as the network effect. This is the effect of the community networks on the performance of these firms, and you can see that it's growing much more steeply for the Kathiawadis than the other two communities. So here is what I think of as a really wonderful example for me as a development economist of how a historically disadvantaged community was able to make the movement from agriculture into international business over the course of a single generation, over 20 or 30 or 40 years. I am sure that the same thing is happening in other industries that we don't even know about, because we never know about the caste structure of these industries, and we don't collect this information for some reason since independence, even though it's clearly very, very important from a social science, from an economics perspective. But you should be clear that these kinds of episodes are probably quite rare. For this thing to actually happen, you needed a large number of Kathiawadi firms to get into the business. And that only happened because you had that massive supply shock in 1979 when the Argyle mines were opened. Okay? But again, as I said, from a policy perspective, there's clearly something here that we can do. If we can jumpstart these networks, then it is possible to actually make these kinds of transformations in entire communities. Now, I don't want you to get this idea that somehow these caste networks are always going to support mobility, that they're always wonderful. What I want to talk about next, in fact, is the opposite. I'm going to talk about how the same caste networks can actually restrict mobility under different circumstances. What we're going to do now is to switch from the city to the village. And we're going to talk about how rural caste networks can restrict the mobility of their members. So to begin with, I'm going to present for you a couple of stylized facts, which you might not know. I certainly didn't know about this until I began this research. The first stylized fact is that in India, the rural-urban wage gap, corrected for cost of living differences, has exceeded 25% for decades. This is way more than it is in comparable developing countries, as you're going to see. And at the same time, what you're going to see in India is that migration, permanent migration of men, male workers, is extremely low. It doesn't mean that mobility in India is generally low. We know that, for example, women have always moved at the time of marriage in rural India. We also know that temporary migration in India is quite high and has actually been increasing over time. It's the permanent migration in India which is actually very, very low. And what we want to do in this is work with Mark Rosenzweig, a colleague of mine, is to understand this. So before I give you an explanation for the low mobility and the large wage gaps, let me just show you what those wage gaps are. So this is the wage gap which is the nominal wage gap. It's not corrected for cost of living differences between the village and the city. But we're comparing three large developing countries, China, Indonesia, and India, around 2004-2005. And this is just very striking to me. If you look at the wage gap in China and Indonesia, it's about 10 or 11%. In India, it's about 45 or 47%. So something in India is really very different. If you correct for cost of living differences and look over time, you see that this wage gap has actually persisted starting from 1983 and going all the way through to 2009. You see a very sharp drop from 1999 to 2004, but that's simply because they changed the definition of what was rural and what was urban. And so certain places that were rural were classified as urban, so not surprisingly the urban wage went down. But nevertheless, if you took care of that, you still see that basically these wage gaps are really very large, even in real terms. Okay, and despite the large wage gaps, you don't see the movement of Indian workers from the village to the city. This is data from the population census, starting from 1961, going all the way through to 2001, and you see that the migration rate is extremely low. It's around 2 to 3%. We don't have the final figures from 2011, but if you look at urbanization, we have some provisional figures there. It hasn't really changed very much from 2001 to 2011. And if you look here again, as I said, at urbanization, you can see how different India is from other large developing countries. This is data from 1975 and from 2000. In 1975, India's third out of four, right? Is about in the middle of the pack. By 2000, it's fallen far behind. This morning at the convocation, Sanjay Bhai was talking about the rapid urbanization that's occurring in India. These data don't suggest that, in fact, you have this rapid urbanization. And certainly it's not as rapid as other comparable developing countries. And so the real question is, what is going on over here? Why is it that urbanization in India, migration in India, is so much lower than it is in other comparable developing countries? And why is it that you can maintain this huge rural-urban wage gap without people moving from the village to the city? So the question that the explanation that we provide in this paper is based on a combination of well-functioning rural insurance networks and missing insurance markets. Okay, the basic idea here is that if it is the case that households with male migrant members lose the service of these caste networks, because once the man or one man in the household has moved to the city, the household as a unit cannot credibly commit to maintaining or fulfilling its obligations in the future, then it's possible that if alternative arrangements are not available, that these households might actually forego these new opportunities. Okay, the basic idea is that when somebody moves to the city, you can't punish him as easily. You don't really know what income he's getting. And even if you find out that this household has reneged on its obligations, it's harder to punish them because they have this other source of support, this person living in the city. And remember, the way that these insurance arrangements work is that when I get a low income in a given year, and Bimal, for example, gets high income, he's going to help me out. In the future, when things are reversed, and I get high income and he gets low income, I'm supposed to help him out. And the way that I'm going to actually do that is because I know that if I don't help him out in the future, all of you who are part of our community are going to punish me. Now, once this household has this migrant member in the city, things become much more difficult because you can't punish them that easily. First of all, they've got this safety net. He's out there in the city, and so if you punish them, they can always rely on this male migrant who's out there somewhere else, who can't be punished. And you certainly can't punish him as easily as you could if he was in the village. And so if, in fact, the ability to punish this household really drops way down, then this network might ultimately say, you know what, if you're going to send someone out to the city, we can't trust you anymore, and we're not going to enter this arrangement with you. You're on your own. Now this household has a choice. It can remain in the village and take advantage of this insurance arrangement and smooth out its consumption over time, or it can send one or more of its male members to the city. Its income will go up, but now it won't be able to smooth out its consumption over time. And if that trade-off works in a certain way, it might end up that this household might say, you know what, I'm going to give up on this substantial income gain by sending this person to the city, and we're going to just remain in the village. That's our explanation. Now, how do you actually test this kind of explanation? Well, the simplest test of this explanation would be to compare populations with and without access to these rural insurance networks. And if you found that those are populations which did not have access to the insurance networks had more migration, then that would be consistent with our theory. The problem is, of course, that these caste networks are ubiquitous in India. And so our solution instead is to look within the caste network, and we try to identify which households benefit the least from this caste-based insurance. And then we check to see whether, in fact, those particular households are the most likely to have migrant members. Okay? Okay, so now, what exactly does insurance do for you? So the simplest way to think about insurance is that, as I was saying earlier, when Bimal has a positive income shock and I have a negative income shock, he gives me something. When I have a positive income shock and he has a negative income shock, I give him something. Another way to think about this is that basically what we are doing is to pool our income. In every period, we take our income, we combine it up, and then we redistribute it on the basis of some kind of pre-specified sharing rule. So if on average, over time, we both have the same income, then we should have an equal sharing rule. right? So in every period, we'll pool our income and we'll just divvy it up. Suppose instead that Bimal actually has twice my income on average. Now the question is, how are we going to actually design that income sharing rule? It turns out that if you are a benevolent social planner, you might not actually want to give him twice the consumption that I get. You might actually want to redistribute income as part of this insurance arrangement in a way that actually makes the total utility of both of us higher. And to understand that, you need to understand a very basic concept in economics, which is utility. And the idea here is that as you consume more of anything, it could be oranges, it could be apples, it could be just about anything at all, you are better off. And that's what you're seeing over here. This is consumption on the horizontal axis, and on the y-axis what you have is utility. And as your consumption increases, your utility does go up. But notice that it's getting flatter and flatter as you keep moving to the right. What that means is that when you move from the first orange to the second orange, the gain in utility that you get is more than what you get when you move from the second orange to the third orange, and so forth. So when you've eaten 1,000 oranges and you go to the 1,001st orange, you're still better off, but not by very much by that point. It's kind of flat. Now think about a world in which, or a network in which there are two individuals, Bimal, who has more consumption or more income than I do. And now think about what would happen if I took $1 of consumption from Bimal and gave it to the poor person, which is me. And what you can see from this diagram very clearly is that my utility would increase much more than his would decrease. Right? Sorry. This thing here is going down by very little. This is a large one. Right? That's the basic idea. That comes from this, the fact that the slope is getting shallower and shallower as we move to the right. So if you were a benevolent social planner, what you would like to do as part of this insurance arrangement would be to actually redistribute so that richer people end up consuming less than they earn, and poorer people end up consuming more than they earn on average. Okay? But now you have to realize that when you do that, some of these rich guys are going to then, that trade-off between staying in the village and leaving is going to kick in. If they're going to benefit less from this insurance arrangement, then they may be more likely to send someone to the city to take advantage of these new opportunities over there. Now, this benevolent social planner is going to take account of that. He's going to realize that he cannot redistribute too much, because when he starts to do that, he's going to lose people from the network who are going to move to the city. And that's not good for the network, because you want more people to be there to smooth out the consumption. But what we show in this paper, this is mathematically quite challenging, is that you will always have some amount of redistribution. What that means is that you will always have that the relatively wealthy people, it's not absolute wealth, it's relative wealth. The relatively wealthy people within the caste will always end up consuming less than they earn on average, and the relatively poor people in the caste will always end up consuming more on average than they earn. Okay? And that is the test that we want to take to the data. Okay? So this is now very preliminary data which gives us evidence on redistribution within the castes. This is data for what is known as ICRISAT, the International Center for Research on the Arid and Semi-Arid Tropics. So this is a research center that has stations all over the world. In India, they have a center in Andhra Pradesh, and they have a small number of villages, about 6 villages in Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh, that they have a small number of households in those villages that they follow over many, many years. They collect very detailed information on the consumption and the income of each member of these households. And what we have over here is data over 7 years on the income of these households and the consumption of these households. And what we do is, there are just 7 castes in these data. So there's not that many castes. But within each caste, we break it up into 5 classes, 5 income classes, given based on the average income of the household. And what we do is to look at the average income within each of those income classes and the average consumption of those households as well. And what you see over here is in the first income class, which is the lowest income class, its income is about 12% of the highest income class, the 5th class. So if you look over here, this thing over here is 1. Right? This is relative income. This is saying that this class over here has 12% of the income of the highest income class. This class over here has 28% of the income of the highest income class, and so on. So if you look at the consumption, you can see that it is much, much higher. The lowest income class, which just has 12% of the income of the highest income class, ends up consuming, its consumption is 46% of the consumption of the highest income class. So what you're seeing here is a very high degree of redistribution within the class. And again, this is something which we have never noticed before. We never thought to look at the level of redistribution within these subcastes. So it's not like the wealthy people within those subcastes are just living on their own and they're sort of independently living. What you're seeing here is that these people are heavily subsidizing the relatively poor people within these subcastes. This is now data from the Rural Economic Development Survey, which I showed you earlier. That was from 1982 and 1999. This is from 2006. And you see the same relatively high degree of redistribution. Now what you see here is that this is, by the way, from 4 states, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka. And you have many, many more villages in these data, and you have many more castes. It's about 100 castes over here. But you still see the same story. The lowest income class earns 30% of the highest income class. That's what you see in what is donated as column 4 over here. But if you look at the consumption, it's as high as 84%. So again, you're seeing this very high redistribution, this high degree of redistribution. And if you turn to the last column, what you see here is that this is also reflected in the migrations. Remember, the story here was that because of this redistribution, some of the relatively wealthy households within the caste are going to be more likely to send someone to the city. And that's exactly what you see. Migration rates are very low, we know that. But for the lowest income classes, they're about 3%. For the higher income classes, they're about 5%. Now, this doesn't take into account the fact that the absolute income and the relative income are going to be strongly related. This is just the relative income. But of course, a household that happens to be in the first income class is also going to be poorer in absolute terms. And you might think that that's going to have a direct effect on their decision to send someone to the city or not. So what you want to do statistically is to control for the household's own wealth and then see whether its relative position within the caste determines its migration decision. Right? And that's what I do next. So what we're doing here is to control for the household's own income or average income, and then see what happens as the average income of its caste increases. So if you fix the household's own income and the average income of the caste increases, what that means is that that household is relatively poor within its caste. And what does our theory say? As the household is relatively poor within its caste, it's being subsidized by wealthier households. It should be more likely to participate in the insurance arrangement within its caste. It should be more likely to marry within its own caste. And it should be less likely to send someone to the city. And that's exactly what you see over here. The red line is participation in the caste insurance network. And that you can see is increasing as the household becomes relatively poor, which is as we move to the right. The green line is whether someone from that household has married outside the caste. This is out-marriage. And you see that that is going in the opposite direction. So when the caste is relatively poor, when the household is relatively poor within its caste, it's less likely to have a member of its household marrying outside of the group. And finally, what you see is that as the household becomes relatively poor, it's going to be less likely to have a migrant member. That's the blue line. Okay? What this does is to make a direct connection between migration and these caste networks. Another way of doing this is to actually look at the amount of income risk that the household actually faces in the village. I'm not showing you those results over here, but what we find is that households which face more income risk are less likely to have migrant members. That's perfectly consistent with our theory, because the more you benefit from the network, the less likely you should be to have someone moving to the city. Suppose there was no network, then in fact if you had more risk in the village, you should be more likely to send someone to the city to diversify your risk. And this just shows you how in fact these caste networks, because paradoxically they are so effective, are actually stifling migration. And the last thing we do in our analysis is to actually estimate a model of migration, to try and see whether we can, how much of the variation in migration across these households, across these communities, we can actually explain with our theory, which is based on these rural insurance networks. And so what we're doing here is essentially what are called counterfactual simulations. What we do is to estimate the model, and then we sort of think about what would happen if the world was different. Okay, so what we have here, the dark line here, is a counterfactual simulation where we change the amount of risk that the household faces when one of its members migrates to the city, and we allow for different degrees of risk sharing. Okay, so the point over here, this point over here is the status quo. condition that we have today. Okay? And what we do as we move to the right is to basically say, okay, now suppose I actually had a household with migrant members, and I reduced the amount of risk that it was going to face. I gave it some new kind of insurance, not based on the caste, but something else. So let's say there was some market insurance or some government-provided safety net which kicked in. What this is telling you is that as the risk that is faced by the household goes down, you see that the level of migration increases tremendously. And it increases from 4% to as much as 12%. Even at that point, you're still very, very far from full insurance, by the way. But you can see how sensitive migration is in our model to the amount of risk that these households are exposed to. The lighter line is where we are changing the wage gap. What we're saying is, to begin with, you have a 20% wage gap. If I reduce that from 20% to 10%, what you find is that, in fact, your migration will only decline from 4% to about 3%. And this is very consistent with what I showed you right at the very beginning, where at the aggregate level, we were seeing huge wage gaps, and you were still not seeing very much migration at all. So what you're seeing over here in our model, which is very consistent with the aggregate data, is that Indian households in the villages are very insensitive to the wage gap, to the urban-rural wage gap. You could change that from 20% to 30%, and it wouldn't make much of a difference at all. What they are really very sensitive to is, in fact, the risk that they face when they lose the caste insurance. And if you could come in with some alternative arrangement, some market-provided alternative arrangement, or some government-provided alternative arrangement, you would increase migration tremendously. Okay, and that's basically what I want to tell you today. As I said, we wanted to ask, the second half of the talk, the question that we started with was, why is it that India has such low migration rates? One explanation could be, given what I've just told you, that perhaps, in fact, the market insurance in these other countries like Indonesia or China is just that much better than it is in India. And there's no evidence that that is true at all. I think the real difference is that the rural insurance networks in India are just much, much better than the alternative arrangements that you have in other countries. And why is that the case? It's because of the particular structure of the caste system. The caste system was not designed to provide rural insurance. It was not designed to provide jobs for its members in the city. It was set up for some other reason hundreds of years ago. It just turns out to be perfectly suited for the construction of networks of different sorts. And so for us, this is just the historical accident. We happen to have a social structure which is very well suited to the formation of well-functioning networks. And once these networks are in place, they basically discourage members from leaving. They don't coerce them. There's no coercion. They're not telling people that we're going to punish you if you leave or at all. The fact that they work so well discourages people from moving to the city. And what happens then is, because they don't move, new markets don't open up in the city, and therefore these networks continue to remain in place. And so our theory is that as long as markets don't operate efficiently, these networks are going to continue to be active. And that is the prognosis for the future. This is data from rural India over a 50-year period. We've talked about the importance of inter and intra-caste marriage in the functioning of these networks. Both for the diamond story as well as for the rural caste networks, used marriage as a proxy for participation in the network. And what you're seeing over here over a 50-year period is very little change in marriage outside of the caste in rural India. It's about 5%. It stayed at 5% from 1950 all the way through to 2000. This is pretty much the number that I've seen in other studies that I've done, including the diamond industry in Bombay. But now, this is data from the Maharashtrian school children that we surveyed in Bombay. This is based on the sisters and the mothers of those school children. If you look at the period from 1970 to about 1985, or even 1990, marriage outside the caste is very low. It's 2 to 4%. But look what happens after 1990. This is when the Indian economy was being restructured. This is when the caste networks in the city were breaking down, because those traditional jobs in the mills and the factories were disappearing. And as those networks broke down, you can see the change in the marriage as well. And that is the point that I'm trying to make over here. I have no doubt that there are other reasons why caste persists in India. But I am sure that one very important reason is because these caste networks continue to be active, and that is because the market has still not thickened enough to the point where these networks cease to be relevant. That's all I have to say. And if that is true, if our story is true, then in fact what NREGA could do, paradoxically, is to actually increase permanent migration. And in fact, data that's coming in says that's exactly what has happened. Migration has actually increased where NREGA has come in. So that's exactly the kind of thing that can happen, which is often unintended, but which can have, I think, in this sense, it is actually a positive consequence of it.
NREGA hasn't worked. So the villages around Ahmedabad are a large magnet. They're still getting NREGA, getting them to participate into NREGA is a big problem. So how would you explain? Is it Gujarat being much more caste conscious and much more close-knit than any other state?
This is a very difficult question for me to answer because there are many reasons why people might not be taking up a program. One reason might be that in Gujarat, perhaps the program is not implemented as well as it is in other states. There is certainly research out there which talks about seepage. As you might imagine, this is a huge program, and there are huge incentives for bureaucrats and local politicians to siphon resources. So that's certainly one possibility. The second possibility is the one that you have raised, in fact, that perhaps these networks are very well functioning in Gujarat, and therefore these people don't really need to go and work for minimum wage for 100 days. They will just use their caste network instead. And the third possibility might be that, in fact, the wage rate that is set by NREGA might be actually much lower than the prevailing wage rate in Gujarat, which might well be the real reason. And it's really hard to tell, but I mean, the point is that, once you start to think in this way, you can start to think about what are the possibilities, I think, which is what we want to do.
Good evening, sir. If I look into your caste economics lecture, I feel it is more of class economics in a hierarchical system of caste. Because in a governmental system like India, where institutional mechanization is very low, means you don't get funded for getting higher education, or in many facets of life, if you see the caste system acts as a class also. Like if you take Marwadis, even if they are lower to Brahmins in a social structure, they are integrated within self. So if you negate their internal system and take them as an individual family, it is the same thing happening around the urban class, where a lower income family cannot take a risk of sending his children to foreign for education. So the same thing is happening within a caste system. So I would think it in terms of class economics rather than caste. What is your take on it?
I think it's really more of an issue of semantics here. I completely agree with you. I think that when people use the word caste, they always think in terms of hierarchies. And certainly my work is not at all about hierarchies. It's all about the subcaste, and there's no hierarchy here at all. It's about the unit. In fact, I would say this is the limitation of my work up to this point, is that I've only focused on the internal dynamics of these particular caste groups. I don't talk at all about the inter-caste relationships, which is where the hierarchies start to come in. So if you want to call that class economics, that's fine. It's just then a matter of semantics. But the point is that I have focused on a particular unit without any regard to the hierarchy at all. And in that sense, yes, I completely agree with you about that. Yeah. Yes, so I think that's correct. So I think one thing that, the question again, I never talked about this. When I was talking about the alternatives to caste-based insurance, I just said market insurance. What does that really mean? It's not like if I live in England or in America, what does market insurance mean? At some level, it's credit. But what it also is a government safety net. If I lose my job, I get access to unemployment insurance. I get access to other sort of support systems. And those are the things that a government can provide as well, which are certainly going to be substitutes for these informal insurance arrangements. And so this is really, I'm not someone who sort of, is a big advocate of social engineering or anything like that. I don't even want to think about this as social engineering. This is really just economic policy. Is that here we have a system that is in place for a good reason. But I think we all would agree, for many different reasons, this is not a system that we want to see sticking around very long. And there are different ways to make it disappear. And one way to do it would be, in fact, to put into place economic institutions, make markets work more effectively, have government programs in place that will substitute for these particular socially, community-based informal institutions.
Very interesting presentation. It's a different take on the way the urbanization process is going on. Because one had an idea that urbanization is low in India also on account of the structure of the economy in terms of capital-intensive manufacturing, high cost of manufacturing, including land, etc. So this is another point of view which is quite interesting. But I do want to ask you another question which I've never understood when economists speak is what is any perfectly functioning market? What is that idea about a perfectly functioning market? Because we also know that markets do create segments of people with different endowments, as one sees the American system, we see in India, etc. Yeah. And so how would the same market help in bringing about mobility? So I'm not really clear conceptually about how all this works. Caste networks, one also sees, is also the way you have said social capital or network that you talked about, are also to reduce transaction costs of formal institutional mechanisms. So it's not just what you have mentioned, but maybe also something added to it. But I would like to have an answer to what is a market, perfectly functioning market.
Okay, is that the one I need to answer? Okay, so I'll do that. That's actually, let me just give you the textbook answer to begin with, because that, at least that will be clear to everyone. So if you look at sort of the textbook, well-functioning, perfectly functioning market, it's a competitive market in which firms are basically price takers. Every firm takes the price of the product. Think about a world in which there's a single product. The firm takes the price of the product as given, because it's too small to affect that price itself by its own production. It takes the available technology as given, and it chooses its production to maximize its profit. On the other side of the market, consumers will take their income as given, they take the prices in the market as given, and they choose their consumption to maximize their utility. That is a well-functioning economy. And that was how economists thought about the world all the way through till maybe the 1970s or 1980s. Since then, there's been a revolution in economics, and I think economists all understand, and they even would say, even about the recent financial crisis, I think 99% of the economists in the world would tell you that markets don't function efficiently. And there are basically two sources of inefficiency. One is information problems, and the other is commitment problems. And I kind of alluded to both in my talk. So the way you think about an information problem is that, think about the labor market. So when I go to a firm and try to get a job, if the firm needs to know my ability, because that's what it's going to be, whether it's going to decide whether it wants to hire me or not, what my wage is going to be, and so forth. If it doesn't know what my ability is, then it can't do that. And that is an example of an information problem. The commitment problem is that when it hires me for a given wage, it expects me to put in a certain amount of effort. And the problem is that often you cannot observe that effort. Now the commitment problem is that if I'm going to work for just a single period, for a single month, and you're going to pay me, I won't put in that effort at all. So these are the two fundamental market sort of failures that economists have sort of identified. And that is the basis for this whole literature on non-market institutions, networks, and so forth. And what these communities do is to essentially solve those problems by using their community ties to solve the information problems, the commitment problems, and so forth. Does that answer your question to some extent?
The markets also don't address the question of unequal endowments. And I think this graph that you've shown about marrying across, if I look at the data of the literacy rates in Gujarat, in fact, the scheduled castes have witnessed the highest improvement in the literacy in state of Gujarat compared to other castes.
Sure.
And so probably this chart that you've shown is also an outcome of change in endowments.
Yes, it is. But by the way, I didn't tell you this, but the graph that I showed you for the changes in education were controlling for changes in education across age cohorts of the entrepreneurs. So in some sense, it was picking up, it was controlling for the kinds of changes that you're talking about. Now, in response to the first thing about the endowments, that's absolutely true, that economists don't really pay attention to the fact that endowments are different in a population. We don't pay attention to the fact that perhaps some people just happen to have less ability than others. And someone needs to take care of that or take account of that. There is, of course, a field of economics called welfare economics or social choice theory, which has thought a lot about those kinds of things. And in a sense, when you look at those caste networks, the results that I was showing you on the redistribution suggest that people are actually taking account of those differences in endowments within these castes. It's something that the market will not do. The market does not care about the fact that I am smart and you are even smarter or whatever it is. It just pays you based on your ability, at some level. But what is clear from these pictures or from these results is that within these caste groups, there is this redistribution. Someone is in fact paying attention to those kinds of differences. So that's another reason why you might think that there is, some reason why you might want to have, once we move away from these caste networks to the market, you really want to have a government in place that is able to at least deal to some extent with this issue of redistribution. You want to make sure, for example, that people have a certain minimum quality of life or standard of living. You want to make sure that when they lose their jobs, there is some kind of unemployment in place. That's the kind of stuff which does not show up at all in your classical economics textbook. But of course, in the real world, you need to account for all of those things.
Professor Munshi, it was a very fascinating study which you've done. I think both components for it. I'm slightly confused about some of your earlier argument regarding when you initially said that more perfect market would lead to social mobility, and it would probably let the communities go away from caste-based structure to a certain kind, maybe a new kind of network or something like that. Whereas the diamond merchant case especially shows us that basically what has happened is the feudal structure has directly got transformed through capitalist structure into a different kind of social network, whereas the social structure has more or less remained intact. The social network has remained intact. And probably I assume that not only caste roles, but also the gender roles and so forth. Everything was strengthened with the coming of, a capitalistic system and with the coming of markets. So then how do we assume that more markets will lead to more socially liberal policies and it won't strengthen some of those older regressive structures?
Yeah, well, when I said that the strengthening of the market would lead to greater mobility, first of all, I was not thinking about policies at all. I was thinking in terms of a world in which essentially the individuals, again, this gets back to the point that I just made about a well-functioning market. In a well-functioning market, everybody is assigned to occupations on the basis of their ability. So if I am born with an intrinsic ability to be, let us say, a musician, then in a well-functioning market, I will end up being a musician. If I'm born with an intrinsic ability to be an engineer, then I will end up being an engineer because that is what the market rewards. In a poorly functioning economy, what happens is a lot depends on your background. So now, if I am the son of an engineer, I will end up becoming an engineer myself in a poorly functioning economy. That was the point that I was trying to make. Now, the example that I gave you with the caste mobility was the point I was trying to make there was that, in fact, these caste networks can actually support mobility in an environment where the market is not functioning. But what you really want to ask yourself is what would happen in a world in which these networks were not there at all, and where the market was just functioning perfectly, there were no credit constraints, and individuals could just do, anyone who had an aptitude for business could become a businessman. You could go to the bank and you could get credit. Of course, that's not the world that we live in. I understand that, right? So you could imagine now, suppose you shut down the networks and you still had imperfect markets, then you would be really screwed in a sense. Because now, these people, no one could get. These people who have moved now, the Kathiawaris, wouldn't be able to move anymore. And there would be very little mobility. So what you need to remember here is that the counterfactual in this case is not in fact the perfect, the perfect market world. It's actually a world where the markets are not functioning perfectly and there are no networks. In that world, you'll have even less mobility. That is so don't get confused by that. You see what I'm saying? Yeah.
So my question is about, from the example of redistribution of income, I think you said that it is already functioning in the social network, and I think that it is a very good in the sense that there is a more cumulative gain for the society and less cumulative loss. So have you thought about how to materialize this into the formal setup, this concept into the formal setup?
But that's the problem. I mean, this is the issue, right? Is that in this arrangement, you can see the redistribution and you can understand why that is happening. When we move to a market economy, you're going to lose these features. These kinds of support, social support systems are going to break down. And that is a real challenge. Because when we move to that point, then what you might end up with is a system in which, yes, everything works very well, and people who, like all of us in this room, who happen to have ability, will be very happy, will do very well. But people who are less fortunate can really get left behind. And I think the US is a very good example of that. Where you really see very huge disparities in incomes, and even in terms of outcomes. And there is no really well-functioning safety net in a place like that. So this is a concern which I think we should all we should really all think about, because my sense is that this movement to the market is inevitable. What you're seeing in this last graph is going to happen. It may not happen in the next 5 years, but it is absolutely going to happen. As we go forward in time, the Indian economy is going to become more and more marketized, and all of these traditional social support institutions are going to break down. And I can see that for myself in my own communities. I'm Parsi, and we're a very small community. And many of the younger generation have moved out and gone abroad. And so now we have a whole generation of older people who have absolutely no one there to take care of them. And this is a real issue when these things start to break down. Because it's not obvious that the market institutions are going to kick in immediately, and it's not clear what the government is going to do at that point in time. But that's not something that I can answer, but it's something which all of you should be thinking about, as we move forward.
A couple of observations on this. In the late 80s, it was 88, 89 to be precise, we conducted a large survey on studying the intergenerational occupational mobility. What we found in a nutshell was that there had been huge changes in the intergenerational occupational mobility, especially in Kathiawar. What has happened was that there had been a large-scale migration towards Surat and Bhavnagar, what you rightly said, especially from Bhavnagar and other areas,
right,
to the diamond cutting industry.
Right.
But that was largely, then we argued, as we also found across the caste, not just across any particular community, but we also found it true to be in the artisan groups. There are a lot of artisans who have been losing out on during that period. One of the reasons that was stated then was that it was due to the recurring droughts. And most of Kathiawar, especially in Saurashtra,
right,
there was not much of water harvesting and other structures, which came up much later. That's one. Now, at that point of time, we did find out with this particular grouping of diamond cutting workers, the reason appeared to be that it is also a pull factor, right, what you pointed out, as much as push factors. So which led to our argument that theoretically at that point of time it was talked only of distress-related migration from rural areas, which we thought it is not true. There is also a pull factor which you point out correctly. To that extent I agree, but it is not really only caste-based networks. If I see it from the network, probably it is, but the whole of Saurashtra, we did witness a large-scale migration towards diamond polishing units. That's one. The second half, I have a comment. For a very long time in India, we have been very fascinated to arrest the rural out-migration. Almost any NGO or any of the work that if you see, the progress report invariably would have a table which said that how much percentage of migration has come down. So I think we have been very obsessed with this fact. And I think it has changed to some extent. Partly this could also be a reason.
Right. Okay, these are very good comments. So let me start off with the first one. So I just want to clarify that when I talk about migration and the use of these networks to support migration, it doesn't mean that individual pull and push factors are not relevant. Of course, it's the case that if there is a massive drought, then people are going to leave, and if there's some pull factor somewhere else, like in Surat, then people are going to leave as well, across different caste groups also, right? So that's certainly the case. The point is that what we were doing here was to sort of compare across those different networks, right? To see how one network strengthened more than the others. In response to the second point about, our obsession with the migration, it's absolutely true. So we always talk about this concern about too much, and I think that must be a very urban phenomenon. We always have this idea that somehow these hordes of people from the village are going to descend on us and then destroy the infrastructure that is already very strained. But as I just showed you, that's not the reality. In fact, India has very little migration. If you compare to other countries, we are way, way lower. And you can see, given the wage gap, that we could increase our productivity dramatically if you actually move these people. I mean, what policy in the world could increase your income by 40%? Even if you adjust for cost of living differences, you're talking about 25%. So there's a huge gain out there in productivity in this country if we can actually increase this type of mobility. Now, I understand that all the city planners in this room are going to be really worried if a horde of people come and descend on your cities, right? So that's something which you have to deal with. That's not my problem. I've just shown you what's out there. You do your job, I'll do my job, right? I mean, that's sort of the...
Could you just throw some light on competition existing between castes, not intercaste, but intra-caste, one. And two is getting in, like having a standard market, won't it bring in equality? So equity and competition.
Okay, so the first question is about competition within the caste. If I have no answer to that because I don't really know enough about it. So for example, in the story with the diamond industry, I'm focusing on the cooperation between these firms within the same caste group, but you must remember that they're also competing with each other because they're all businessmen. Now, how these firms actually manage to play this game, where on one hand they are competitors and on the other hand they are cooperating, I really don't know. Because for me as an academic economist, I have a really hard time for people that I'm competing with thinking of them as my friends. So how they do it, I absolutely don't know that. I don't have an answer to that. It's a very good question because that's clearly something which is out there, these two competing things. Can you just, sorry, I'm getting tired now. What was the second question? Oh, about the equity. Equity, yeah. So I think one dimension on which you clearly have inequity in a network-based economy is that there are some groups that benefit way more than others. Those groups which are very lucky to have a network are basically going to do very well, and those that are not are going to do very badly. However, within the groups that are lucky to have a network, people who are relatively weak will also do really well. So there is a sense in which there is inequity across groups, but within group, there is much more equity. In a market system, you would not have that. There, what you would have is inequity across individuals with different levels of ability, because the people with ability would do really well, and the people with less ability would do really badly. But you would not have this intergroup inequity, which you see in a network-based economy. Does that answer the question?
So my question is regarding some political milestones during this tenure. For example, if you take the example of Mandal Commission, which came in 1990s. So is that kind of political milestone is part of your study, because that have a lot of influence if you see the states like Bihar and UP, and how they started strengthening themselves and functioning as a community, and also the regional politics. Right. So how do you see these kind of political milestones affecting the economy and also the caste network? Right. Because in context of Gujarat, the caste system, personally I believe, is not like the Bihar and UP, because it runs deep down the system. Right. So what's your thought on that?
Right. So just to begin with, this is something which in some sense, as I said, is a limitation of my current research up to this point, is that I haven't really looked very much, first of all, at intercaste relationships, which are very important. And that's something which I'm slowly starting to work on now. The other thing is I haven't really focused very much on the other dimensions along which the caste system has persisted. For example, the political reservation that you're talking about, the caste politics that you're talking about, those things I haven't really addressed in my research. My work has been much more on, in some sense, the independent role of these underlying caste networks and how they continue to support economic activity, in some sense parallel to all these other things that are happening. So we're all used to what you're saying. We all understand these things, and I don't want to play them down or undermine them. For sure, caste politics is really relevant. For sure, all these other things really matter. Caste reservation really matters too. In some sense, I have sort of not ignored that, but abstracted away from that in my research. And that's, as a researcher, that's always, you have to do that. You have to make choices about what you're going to focus on.
If I understood you correctly, I'm confused. It sounded like in the villages, there are caste organizations that provide certain levels of security. And when someone leaves the village to the city, the villagers are not so happy about that because it threatens to break down that solidarity. On the other hand, when the Kathiavaris left Kathiavar for Surat, people were supportive of the leave out. Why?
Okay, so one, that's a great question, and I should have actually said something about this. So I'm glad you brought it up in one of the last two questions. The first point is that the way that I think about this is that these caste networks will support mobility of groups of people. So if it's a group of people moving together in some sense, you're not going to really lose the solidarity. You can still maintain the trust because there are enough people moving together as a group to punish or to maintain the discipline. When a single individual moves, that's when it's a problem. So the story about the Kathiawadis was about a story about a whole group of people moving from one occupation into another. The story that I was talking about later on, the second half of the talk, was about a single individual or a single household trying to set up on its own. And that, I think, is the distinction. Now, how this actually plays itself out in an economy over time, this sort of tension between individual movements and group movements, that is something which I'm again starting to work on right now. But in terms of just explaining why you see these two seemingly sort of confusing things, it's just simply that. The simple answer is you can move in groups and it's not a problem. You can't move on your own. That's all.
Sir, excellent insight into the caste-based economics. Sir, I have only one or two observations. See, today, if you look to the present-day situation, the rural-urban divide and interstate diversity has attracted the attention of the multilateral institution. IFC Washington has set up dedicated office in the state of Bihar, and they have broad-based the microfinance institution and agro-processing industries. So that has a significant impact on this caste-based mobility. Mm-hmm. And today, if you see the institution of microfinance, inclusive drive, banks dedicated to set up of RCT, Rural Self-Employment Training Institutes, that has a significant impact on the rural population. And government-sponsored schemes like Pura, provision of urban amenities in rural areas, these things have significant impact on this rural-urban divide. So how do you look at this study if you look at the present-day situation? Will it pass the test of validity in the present-day context?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, there's two ways in which these networks, these rural networks can break down. One is, of course, if the market starts to provide services that substitute for what these networks are providing. And the other is, if, for example, the government or some external agency comes in. And so the kinds of arrangements that you're talking about are all along those lines. So once you have, microfinance, then you don't really need your caste network as much. Once the government comes in with some other kind of scheme, you don't need your network as much. And at the end of the day, my view, I'm of course, an economist, and so I always think that, what you want to do is to move towards the market. With all its problems, it's still the only game in town that really, delivers the kinds of levels of economic productivity that we would want. Then those are all the kinds of schemes that will help in that process. Because I think the real problem now is that we have these very well-functioning networks and we have these weak markets. And the problem is that we can't get from one place to the other. Because these networks are strong, the markets are weak. Because the markets are weak, the networks are strong. Right? So how do you get out of this equilibrium that you're in? And what you have to do is to break it down in different ways. And what you're suggesting are all, those are all ways in which this will ultimately break down. It's just going to be a difficult process. It's not going to be so simple precisely because these non-market institutions in India are so strong. They actually help us in the short run, but in the long run, they actually slow things down for us. And that's just the reality. This is because of the structure of our society.
Thank you so much, Professor Munshi. May I request Sri Jaya to give Professor Munshi a token of our thanks? May I now request Professor Parthasarathi to deliver the vote of thanks?
I'm sure all of you would agree that it was a treat in the evening after the convocation that we had. What's more interesting is that the institutions, the networks that Professor Munshi had touched upon, we all know that some of the documentations like for 100 years of cotton, Indian cotton, and the trade guilds and other networks that had substituted the market for a very long time in India, those had been documented. And we also studied from the migration and the networks point of view some of the institutions. But this is a fresh thought that Professor Munshi has brought in. And it is absolutely refreshing to see from the network perspective and from the organization's perspective. And therefore, I would like to thank Professor Munshi for the contribution to the studies on networks. All of you for participating and asking very interesting questions, and my sincere thanks on behalf of everybody and on behalf of CEPT University to Professor Munshi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. If you are interested in our lecture series, please look up our website, www.fAAA.org.in.